Whisky has long tried to feel serious and untouchable. Do you think that helped it grow, or is it holding it back today?
I mean, that's a good question, right? I mean, whiskey's traditions are long-standing, and for a long time, I think there's been a real tradition around not just how to drink whiskey, but who can drink whiskey. Frankly, that's ridiculous, right? Whiskey, all spirits are for everyone. You know, if your palate enjoys the flavour of a whiskey, then enjoy it as you wish. So I would not turn my back on those traditionalists. Certainly, they have helped grow the category, especially when it comes to the categories of single malt whiskey. You know, there's a lot of chin strokers or potentially gatekeepers to that world of whiskey. And my role at Johnnie Walker, and really my brand, Johnnie Walker's role, is to make whiskey incredibly democratic. It is to promote fun with whiskey and to promote diverse ways of enjoying whiskey, not just in cocktails, not just in highballs, not just in classic style cocktails or innovative serves that we see in world class, but also different occasions. So Johnnie Walker has always been a spirit of progress that is opening up new occasions for whiskey drinkers, different times of the day, different parts of the world, and certainly different demographics of people as well.
When you look at younger drinkers today, what do they do differently with whiskey, and what do you like about that?
Yeah, I think younger drinkers today are potentially much more responsible than previous generations. We've seen, premiumization not just be a trend, but a movement in terms of people are drinking less, they're drinking better. And I think the younger generations are much smarter around the ways that they want to consume everything, not just alcohol, but also the foods that they eat. So with that in mind, I think younger generations are open to interpretation and open to experimentation. So the way we drink whiskey today is vastly different to how it was consumed 50 or 100 years ago, or even 10 years ago, which I think is exciting. The best way to drink whiskey is the way you want to try it. And as long as you're not ultimately sacrificing the integrity of that incredible blend or that incredible masterpiece, which has had so much work go into it, I'm all for it.
Which classic whiskey cocktail do you think is the most misunderstood today, and what should it taste like at its best?
Probably my favourite whiskey cocktail. I mean, there's probably two, depending on the time of day of the week, or potentially depending on who's paying. I do love I'm a traditionalist in the sense that I've always loved Manhattans. There's a famous Simpsons episode, I think, where Bart Simpson is the mobster's bartender, and Fat Tony yells out, "What did I do to deserve this flat, flavourless Manhattan?" And it's only Bart Simpson that can make this ultimate Manhattan. And I think there's a certain truth in that sense, that a Manhattan, which is ultimately whiskey, vermouth and bitters, so few ingredients, but so many ways that those components can go wrong. And much like the martini, it's often maligned and misunderstood, and it's often made poorly. So I explore many different ways of making Manhattans, including the Rob Roy, which is made with Scotch, obviously. And for me is the ultimate cocktail. It's the ultimate, when made correctly, aperitif. It can be dry and it can be uplifting, or it can be quite rich and heavy and digesting when made in a slightly different way. Probably the other cocktail which springs to mind is the highball. And again, so few ingredients, but can be made so poorly, but so incredibly well. For me, my favourite highball at the moment is Johnnie Walker Black Label. No surprises there. With some ginger kombucha, something that's quite low sugar but big on flavour, and then potentially like a heavy squeeze of fresh orange or heavy squeeze of grapefruit. And that sort of balance between the harmony between Black Label, which is quite spice-driven, underlying peat, underlying fruit and tropical character, with ginger kombucha, a natural kind of bedfellow, if you will, and then a squeeze of grapefruit. It's just quite vibrant and fresh and delicious. Perfect for this warm weather in Prague we're having.
When does using an expensive whiskey in a cocktail feel like a waste to you, and when does it actually make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the price points of whiskies are a huge talking point at the moment, right? There's people all over the world looking for great value in everything that they purchase. I think what I'd like to say first and foremost when it comes to the price of whiskey is that you don't need to spend a lot of money to have a great whiskey. And certainly in the world of Johnnie Walker, we've got whiskies at different price points along our entire range. And each of those whiskies have a certain cost of goods that goes into them, even down to Johnnie Walker Red Label and a new variant, Johnnie Walker Red Soul. We have incredible whiskies that go in from our liquid library of close to 11 million casks laying to rest in Scotland. So even at our most entry-level price point, we're very proud of the whiskies that go into that. What ultimately changes is the time and the rarity of those liquids. So some whiskies take longer to develop, and in that time, obviously, there is a much heightened sense of evaporation, which means that whiskey is concentrated and we're getting less of it. There's also much more time. There's also more maintenance that goes into producing those whiskies. The rarity story is another one. We obviously, for Johnnie Walker Blue Label and some of our other more luxury variants, use whiskies that are just no longer around anymore. That combination of very old, mature whiskey with whiskey that simply is not around from distilleries that are now ghosted means that naturally the price point is higher. But with that in mind, I think you can make incredible cocktails with variants from Red Label to Johnnie Walker Black Label. We've launched in certain markets Johnnie Walker Black Ruby as part of our Johnnie Walker Black Label collection, which are made to go hand in hand for cocktails. And more we're seeing consumers enjoy whiskey not just in a neat or on the rocks proposition. We're seeing them want to experiment with even classic style cocktails like Negronis or Brambles. And we're now producing liquids which are custom made for those styles of drinks. So we're listening to consumers. We're seeing how consumer behavior is changing with whiskey drinkers all over the world. And we're reacting to that by producing these liquids at an entry-level price that are made for cocktails. So it's probably one thing I'd always sort of stress is you don't need to blow your bank account or your budget to buy great whiskey for cocktails. You just need to understand what the flavor profile is of the whiskey and what that whiskey has been made to ultimately do.
When people hear Johnnie Walker, many think of a safe choice. Do you see that as a strength or a limitation?
What an amazing thing to be renowned as a safe choice and a consistent product. I think Johnnie Walker, and as purely as a custodian of the brand, as someone that gets to wave the flag for Johnnie Walker, someone that has a connection to our incredible blending team and marketing teams and innovation teams, I'm incredibly proud that Johnnie Walker almost sits at the table of so many of life's milestones around the world. I think our bottles have been witness to countless weddings, birthdays, Mother's Days, Father's Days around the world, and that privilege of being able to sit on that table and bear witness to these celebrations, I think, is something we're incredibly proud of. I think when you think about Johnnie Walker as a safe choice, that's a really great thing to understand. But at the same time, the opposite of that is we've always been a brand that has pushed the category of whiskey forward. That spirit of progress, that mentality of keep walking has always lied at the heart of John Walker initially and Alexander Walker, his son, as time has gone past. So we've always led in the world of innovation. We've always pushed in completely different flavor profiles or blending processes, or in the case of our square bottle or slanted label, certain packaging innovations. So that will always continue to be at the heart of what we do at Johnnie Walker. So as much as we have our staple portfolio, we're never going to stop innovating. You're always going to see new variants come out for Johnnie Walker. And it's always important to pay attention to ambassadors like myself who can help you decipher what that whiskey is for and potentially who it's for and at what time of day or which time of year.
You travel all over the world. Where do you see the most exciting whiskey scenes emerging outside the traditional centres?
Wow, that's a really great question. As I mentioned before, I'm a custodian for a brand that's available, I think at this stage in around 180 plus markets. We are a staple of back bars and drinks trolleys in so many regions around the world. And in a lot of those regions, we are so ingrained within the culture that we almost have a cult-like status within those markets. I get incredibly excited to travel to regions like Latin America, for example, which, for a bunch of markets which ultimately produce a lot of sugarcane products, have a deep connection to the world of Scotch whisky and Johnnie Walker specifically. So being in those markets are always incredibly exciting because people are so passionate about the brand. And we're seeing emerging markets like India become more and more relevant to Johnnie Walker, and even their whiskey industry themselves is starting to grow. So I get excited as well when these markets, which are not just idolizing brands like Johnnie Walker, are also producing their own whiskey and having their own individual say on the whiskey climate around the world. You've got to remember, as much as I'm the Johnnie Walker ambassador, I'm also a huge lover of whiskey around the world, and there's very few whiskies that I've tasted that I haven't agreed with necessarily. So I'm all for whiskey consumption, and I'm all for craft distilleries producing their own styles of whiskey. But certainly, Johnnie Walker as a gateway for some of these whiskey drinkers in parts of these worlds is such an exciting thing to be a part of.
Do you see a real difference in how people think about whiskey in Europe versus Asia or Latin America?
Well, ultimately, I think there's a lot of traditionalists within Europe when it comes to whiskey drinking. You are technically almost part of the continent that produces all the world's Scotch whiskey. I think that those shackles are starting to be broken in this new generation of drinkers. I think we're seeing huge growth in mixed drinks, especially in the world of Scotch whiskey. And those sort of on the rocks or traditionalists where we just drink whiskey neat in front of a fire with a cat on our lap, playing Scottish music in the background, are starting to disappear. So that comparatively to an Asian market, which you've sort of mentioned, Southeast Asia have a lot more fun with Scotch whiskey, dare I say. Markets like the Philippines, which is huge for Johnnie Walker, Thailand, Vietnam, they're not afraid to mix whiskey, not just in innovative ways, but with local ingredients. And we're seeing that in the world of cocktails around the world, where world class is not just about lifting up these markets in the world of making cocktails for their consumers, but they're seeing all of their bartenders start to connect their local cultures and ingredients with our wonderful brands. And that's exciting to see when you start to see quite traditional spirits like Scotch whiskey served with individual ingredients which are only available in certain regions.
You won World Class Bartender of the Year 2012. Do you think the bar scene has improved since then, or just gotten better at selling itself?
Thank you for remembering. No, 2012 was the pinnacle of bartending globally forever. All jokes aside, I mean, I've been a part of the World Class program since 2011. I was lucky enough to compete the year previous to me winning as well. And dare I say, when I competed, there were probably half a dozen to a dozen countries which could have potentially won. And they were all the countries which were traditionalists in the world of cocktails. Your Great Britain, the US, North America, very traditional cocktail countries, and Japan. And then today, what I've sort of noticed, or at least in the last 5, 6, 7 years, is there's so many more markets emerging as potential world-class winners. So where I competed, 14 years ago, there might have been a dozen countries that could have won. These days, there's potentially 30 countries that could win. And you see that in the world-class challenge, world-class winners' diversity. The 15 or 16 bartenders that have won it are all incredibly diverse human beings. They all have their individual styles. They all come from a vast and varying amount of countries now, and that's exciting to see. So I think the winner of World Class in that top 5 will always be an impeccable standard. And I always say top 5 because, it doesn't necessarily mean that I was the best bartender in the world that year. It just meant that the judges scored me the highest. I have huge respect for anyone that can make that final 5, 6, 7, 8. And they're all likely worthy winners who maybe get lucky or not on the day. So it's exciting to see that there's more and more countries in it to win it.
What separates a good bartender from a truly exceptional one today?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a great bartender has almost nothing to do, and this might be controversial, but it has nothing to do with what's in the glass. It more has to do with the way that they're able to connect with you as a guest or as a judge. So that's personality. It's a sense of humility. So obviously that desire to want to serve your life and to ensure that the customer always feels like that you're on their side. And then thirdly, it's probably that sense of hospitality. So that humility, that personality, and that hospitality, those inherent 3 characteristics, I think, is what makes you want to sit in front of a bartender. It makes you want to come back and leave your home and spend some time socializing in a place which is outside of your workplace or your home, that third space. So if you can connect those three things with a judge, as well as have exceptional characteristics of the actual drinks making process, you've gone a long way to doing really well in world class and being a great bartender, separating yourself from being a good bartender to a great bartender.
Do you think bartenders today actually know more than before, or just present their knowledge differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, back in my day, make myself sound like an old man. There was a desire to hunt for knowledge, and knowledge was power. To use a fairly stereotypical term, and we didn't have as much access to the internet, and even the access we did have to the internet, the information wasn't on there. So if I wanted to understand the mash bills of the 12 bourbons that I had on my back bar, it would have been harder for me to find that information. So I would have needed to read books that were written on bourbon, for example. These days, I think brands are a lot more transparent with information. They understand that bartenders were searching for that information, so they're a lot more open with their production methods, with their recipes. And so bartenders, they don't desire that information as much as we might have. I think some of the things that we probably were a lot more stringent on in my generation of bartending was the technical side of bartending, to ensure that the process when it comes to making drinks is as pristine as possible. Whereas these days, I think there's a lot more heightened focus on innovation and becoming a lot more streamlined, but also being more connected to your audience via social media, which is certainly a skill and certainly something that bartenders are a lot smarter at doing these days. Building your own personal brand, connecting with your guests on social media before the guest even comes into your venue, and building that desire through engaging with an audience digitally. I think it's certainly a skill, and it's very, very relevant to today's great cocktail bars.
Johnnie Walker is one of the most iconic whiskey brands in the world. How do you keep something like that authentic today when it's such a global product?
Yeah, I think so. Johnnie Walker will always, and especially Johnnie Walker Black Label, it will always be an icon of the whiskey world. The flavor profile within this glass will remain unchanged. The recipe will always differ with the whiskey stocks we have available, but the flavor profile will remain unchanged. It has done so since 1908, and it will hopefully for another 100, 200 years to come. The audience, however, does change, right? The new generations come through, new drinking habits come to light, and being able to pivot, not necessarily your liquid, but pivot the way that you target your audience will always change. So the way that we evolve will always be with our audience. It will never be against it. We are a brand that does keep walking, to borrow a very famous slogan. And the way that we show up in mixed drinks and our serve strategies will always adapt to local tastes.
What's something about blending that most people never see, but that has a huge impact on the final taste?
Yeah, I mean, the world of blending it's that balance between art and science. And I'm very fortunate to be connected to Emma Walker, our master blender, and her team of 12 whiskey masters. Their world is completely different to the world of a bartender, for example, where for me to be able to blend a perfect cocktail, I have full control over my ingredients. So to make a daiquiri, I might find the most pristine lime juice. I might make a fresh sugar syrup, and I'll find the cleanest and most delicate and floral white rum I can find. I'll then use my technique and excellence to be able to craft that in perfect ratios, and my technique with how I shake, how I strain, the quality of the ice I used, how cold my glassware is. I control every single one of those things. In the world of blending, they might be asked to make a daiquiri, but with different ingredients every single time. So to be able to find that balance with differing ingredients constantly, that ever-changing supplies that we have, the ever-changing liquid library, which they have control of, is a difficult thing. And then to be able to balance that in these huge vattings that we obviously do to be the world's biggest whiskey is an incredible skill. And then to be able to provide it at a price point that we do and a consistent flavor profile that we do it in, I think is absolutely magic. It's batching cocktails on a whole new level. So we're very fortunate to have that team, and I think the world of blending sometimes is maligned because I think it's misunderstood in the sense that we're in a clandestine way. We're hiding bad whiskey in our blends. But the reality is, we have access to close to 50% of the world's Scotch, and we're the flagship whiskey brand within the Diageo portfolio. So the access that we have to whiskies is always first and paramount, and the quality of those whiskies need to be of the most pristine level to be able to produce whiskey at the price point we do for the balance and the flavour profile that we make it at. So it's an incredible world, and I think the more time you get to speak to blenders, the more you understand this is magic.
How should bartenders think about Johnnie Walker today, as an ingredient or as a finished product that should be respected as it is?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think, sometimes I think traditionalists in whiskey will tell you can't mix whiskey or it has to be consumed in a certain way. The more you understand about cocktail making, the more you understand about Scotch whiskey's flavour profile, you understand that Scotch potentially has the largest breadth of flavour than any spirit category in the world. Potentially agave spirits or mezcals, you can have incredibly contrasting flavour profiles. But if we talk about Scotch whiskey, and if we talk about Johnnie Walker Black Label specifically, you can pull out of this particular liquid fruity characteristics, malty, spicy, certainly peaty, which is a very traditional flavour profile, fresh ingredients, and fresh flavour profiles. The whiskies that go into this, we use things like Cardu, which has vibrant orchard fruit and apple flavour. We use Glenkinchie, which is quite dry and grassy and floral. We use Kalila, which is quite iodine and smoke heavy, but still has a real backbone of fruitiness to it. And then we might use Kleinlich, which has tropical fruit character and almost a waxy texture. That all sits on a canvas of impeccable grain whiskey, which is sweet and is incredibly voluptuous in the mouth and gives that mouthfeel which works so well in cocktails. So for a bartender that understands those flavour profiles and that breadth of flavour, you can certainly look to complement and enhance those flavours, or you can contrast them. Because that flavour is so concentrated, it also works incredibly well in low ABV cocktails. Seems like a little bit of a misnomer that you can use Scotch whiskey in low ABV cocktails. But because of that inherent spice, that boldness of flavour, using even 10, 15 mils of a whiskey just to season a drink means that you have a low ABV cocktail that is full of flavour. And mixing it with something like ginger kombucha, which I mentioned earlier, you've got this incredibly bold and flavourful drink, with no sugar, and you're only using a half measure to be able to create that rich flavour.
Is there a style of cocktail where you personally would never use Johnnie Walker?
As a style of cocktail, well, it's a style of cocktail where I would never use Johnnie Walker. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a time and a place for all spirit categories, right? I'm the advocate for Scotch whiskey in cocktails. So I certainly find myself at times, having a Tanqueray number 10 martini. I wouldn't certainly replace Johnnie Walker Blue Label with Tanqueray and a martini and mix Johnnie Walker Blue Label with a dry vermouth, for example. Scotch and dry vermouth, I think, are probably natural clashes. If I wanted to make something like a dry Manhattan, I would use a sweet vermouth in a lower ratio. So there are certainly ingredients I wouldn't recommend mixing with Scotch. Up until only a few years ago, I would religiously say that Scotch whiskey doesn't belong with lime juice. There's an example. And there's one classic cocktail, to my knowledge, which does it well, and it's a Morning Glory Fizz. And even then you pair lemon and lime juice. This is getting nerdy cocktail bartendery now. But then in the last 5 years, we've produced liquids and different variants like Johnnie Walker Blonde and Johnnie Walker Red Soul, which is launching, which its natural malt characteristic and some of the wheat whiskey we use in the grain component works really well with lime juice. So you can replace it in a cosmopolitan, or you can replace it in drinks like a daiquiri or a Mai Tai, and you've got this incredibly great Scotch whiskey that pairs well with tiki drinks or lime juice cocktails. So, I'm all for experimentation. There are certainly certain ingredients which I wouldn't match certain variants of Johnnie Walker in.
Where can a brand like Johnnie Walker still go to stay relevant for the next generation of drinkers?
Yeah, we'll always continue to look at where our whiskey is starting to gain traction and where we're needing to, recruit consumers to the world of Scotch whiskey. Consumer behaviour lies at the heart of what we do. We listen. Not only do we just listen to where whiskey drinkers want to drink or how they want to drink, but we also understand consumer behaviour in how much people like to drink. So in the future, I think Johnnie Walker will continue to innovate. We'll always have our icons of our brand, so our blue labels and our black labels and our red labels will remain unchanged and part of the portfolio. But at the same time, we'll continue to grow and invent new liquids that listen to consumer behaviour and hopefully try to recruit people to what I believe is the greatest spirit category in the world.
What still surprises you about whiskey, even after all these years?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain Scotch whiskies I taste which I still can't necessarily pick out of a lineup because of that depth of flavour. Now, I mean, Johnnie Walker Black Label, as an example, I could probably pick in a lineup of 100 whiskies. You know, it's so consistent, it's so familiar to me, and I pick out the same profile every time I taste it. In fact, I've got a saying that the rarest bottle of whiskey I have in my house, and I've been able to forage a lot of whiskies from my time in this role. The rarest bottle of whiskey I have in my house is a full bottle of Johnnie Walker Black Label because it's always open. It's always open because I'm always going back to it. And it's a whiskey I love to entertain with. It's a whiskey I like to enjoy with my wife when I'm watching a football game or whether I'm making cocktails with friends or a highball for myself. But something like Johnnie Walker Blue Label, on the other hand, I'm constantly surprised at how little I can pick out the flavour profiles instantly. And that liquid stays the same because of that depth of flavour. Some days, depending on the moon phase, depending on how warm it is, depending on what I've eaten, I might pick out things like the orange and sherry notes. At other times, it'll be the cigar box, sandalwood, hazelnut characteristics. Other times, it's more of that sort of peat and cacao influence that I can pick up. So I'm constantly surprised by whiskies of excellent quality that are blended, how differing they can taste depending on the time of day or what I've consumed that day.
If you could forget everything you know about whiskey and start again, what would you do differently?
If I could taste whiskey for the first time again, I'd probably not start by drinking it neat. I think I think that really polarizes people instantly. I think whiskey is and especially things like Johnnie Walker Black Label, which is proudly bold in flavour, or Johnnie Walker Blue Label, which has an incredible depth. I think the way we can actually turn off an audience is by serving it neat. I think if I was to start again, I would love to know that I could have experimented much earlier, whether that's just having it over a few cubes of ice or whether that's adding a splash of ginger ale to open up some of those flavours. I think my world of whiskey loving would have been recruited a lot earlier if I was able to do that and people told me to do that. Whiskey gatekeepers, I think they're proud of our category and I think they play an important role in the world of Scotch, but certainly I think we need more people being open to experimentation with whiskey.
That was another episode of the Visit Chef magazine podcast, featuring a conversation with Tim D. Phillips, Johnnie Walker Global Ambassador. You can find all episodes in our archive at visitchef.com/podcast, as well as on all major podcast apps. Feel free to contact us, we'd love to hear from you. We'll be back with a new episode soon, and we're already looking forward to having you with us again.